When it came to fighter aces during World War II, the Luftwaffe was unmatched. They forged over 2,500 pilots who would be classified under the Allied standard as ace pilots. The highest scoring of these aces stand miles above the aces forged by other nations, with many pilots having shot down 100 or more enemy aircraft. The names of many are well remembered today by pilots, historians, and aviation enthusiasts. But there are two pilots who stand out in this regard. They are Erich Hartmann, the highest scoring pilot of all time, and Hans-Joachim Marseille, the highest scoring ace in the North African campaign. Now it makes sense as to why Hartmann, with his 352 aerial victories, remains an icon. But what about Marseille? Despite achieving an incredible 158 aircraft kills, Marseille is not even close to the remarkable achievement of Hartmann. In fact, a quick check on Wikipedia lists him behind his fellow Luftwaffe pilots as the 30th highest scoring ace. Despite this, there is more to Marseille's kill count than meets the eye, and as historians note, there is ample reason suggesting that Marseille may have been an equal to Hartmann and perhaps the greatest of the Luftwaffe pilots. Marseille had a rather short career. Before learning to fly, he had come from a broken family, divorced parents with whom he was on poor terms, and an older sister who was murdered by her partner. It is unclear how much exposure Marseille had to flying before 1938, when he signed up to the Luftwaffe at age 19. During the early days of the war, he was seen as a talented but troubled individual. At Wehrmacht fighter pilot school in 1939, he was trained by World War I ace Julius Arrighi, who saw potential in the young Marseille. He received a great evaluation the following year, and several months later would see action in the Battle of Britain. Here, he scored his first victory, but in the following weeks would receive harsh criticism from those around him. In one case, he abandoned his wingman to engage an enemy aircraft, and in another, he abandoned his squadron leader to chase another aircraft. In the latter incident, Marseille was hit and bailed out, and upon being rescued and hospitalized, his commanding officer rebuked him, informing him that his squadron leader had been shot down and killed as a result of his careless actions. The commanding officer tore up Marseille's evaluation papers and left. Seen as arrogant, he became disliked by his fellow pilots and superiors, and was soon thereafter removed from the squadron. Before he left, he had scored a number of successive victories. Rudolf Resch decided to bring Marseille into the elite JG-52 squadron in December 1940, but this also would not last long. His temperamental attitude and interests annoyed the clean-cut ace pilots around him, including Johannes Steinhoff. Within days, Resch had Marseille confined to his room for a week after calling another pilot a goofy pig. The next week, Steinhoff became displeased with Marseille, whom he noted spent all of his time chasing women, playing jazz music on the piano, which was technically an offense in Nazi Germany, and drinking to such an extent that he would often be too sick to fly, or simply could not be found. But perhaps what irritated Steinhoff the most was that Marseille lacked the discipline to fly as a reliable wingman. Thus, he was transferred to JG-27 on December 24th and placed under the command of Eduard Neumann, who immediately took note of his bad attitude, but nevertheless came to like him, noting decades later that Marseille could only be one of two, either a disciplinary problem or a great fighter pilot. JG-27 was sent to Yugoslavia to aid in the invasion, but was soon transferred to North Africa in April 1941. During his first 4 months in Africa, Marseille scored several kills. However, he was also shot down a number of times and would regularly take heavy damage from enemy aircraft during his attacks, a result of his fearless, or maybe reckless, diving down upon enemy formations. Neumann grew impatient with his flying, which regularly resulted in Marseille's aircraft returning as a write-off. Neumann encouraged Marseille to adopt new tactics such as deflection shooting, as well as exercising for higher G tolerance. Finally, by August 1941, he had begun doing just that, and it is only here that Marseille appears to have come to his senses, or was at least isolated enough to focus on flying, and where his ace career really begins. From here on out, he would see massive success in North Africa, yet his career would only span 1 year, dying on September 30th, 1942, from a botched ejection after his cockpit had filled with smoke. Thus, in these 13 months, Marseille had done more than practically any other pilot. If he had survived this ejection, there is no telling how many victories he would have achieved although if consistency is any guess, then he would have possibly outperformed Hartmann's 350 kills. In stark contrast, Hartmann, who was 3 years younger than Marseille, was familiar with flying from an early age. His mother had been one of Germany's first female glider pilots and taught Hartmann to fly both the glider and light aircraft. This seems to have happened before Erich had turned 10 years old. By the time of the Reich, the 14-year-old Hartmann had joined the Hitler Youth, where he worked as a gliding instructor, eventually receiving his full pilot's license. By 1940, at age 18, he had been accepted into Air War School, rapidly progressing to his first instructed flight 4 days after arriving and flying his first solo flight 2 weeks after that. By August 1942, at the age of 20, he had completed all training and was ready for combat. He was assigned to the elite JG-52 and sent to the Eastern Front in October. Flying alongside some of the best pilots in Germany, Hartmann had completed mock aerial training, to which some of the other experienced pilots had noted his potential despite his inexperience. His first mission was on October 14th, flying wingman to Edmund Rossmann during the Battle of the Caucasus. Flying high, the pair spotted a group of enemy aircraft below. Before issuing orders, Hartmann broke away from Rossmann, entered a full-speed dive, and opened fire. Failing to hit anything, Hartmann narrowly avoided collision with one of the aircraft before scrambling into the clouds for cover. Soon after, his aircraft ran out of fuel and he crashed. Following this incredibly disorderly conduct, Rossmann refused to fly with him again. However, Hartmann would soon start his career as an ace when he scored his first kill in November 1942 against an IL-2. His career as an ace fighter pilot would last for the remainder of the war. While Hartmann was more than capable in a drawn-out dogfight, he would often resort to short, quick attack runs against enemy aircraft in formation. A common tactic he employed was to simply climb to higher altitudes, hunt for low-flying enemy aircraft, and then swoop in, releasing a volley of bullets before peeling away to safety. This tactic worked fine on the Eastern Front, since Soviet pilots, especially those flying the IL-2, would often fly lower to the ground, since many were tasked with bombing or close air support missions. Consequently, Hartmann knew how to exploit an altitude advantage, as well as a knowledge of particular angles of attack to remain hidden and avoid enemy fire as much as possible. As much as these tactics were standard practice, Hartmann took them to a new level of precision. He was particularly gifted in calculating and executing the timing of these attacks. This gift certainly set him apart from his counterparts on the Eastern Front. It was also known that Hartmann, despite being more than capable in a dogfight, preferred not to engage in such aerial brawls. According to Hartmann himself, his tactic was known as see, decide, attack, break. He also said that he would carefully assess enemy aircraft before engaging in any fights, and would take note of the range at which any particular enemy aircraft would start to engage. If the enemy opened fire from a distance, he was likely an amateur, acting out of fear and likely easy prey. If the enemy closed in with discipline, without opening fire, he was more experienced, and perhaps engaging in a dogfight should be reconsidered. Flying in Jagdgeschwader 52, a fighter wing that flew only the Messerschmitt Bf-109, Hartmann was also flying with the best pilots in the Luftwaffe, including his friend Günther Rahl and Gerhard Barkhorn, together the 3 highest-scoring pilots of all time. It is recorded that his wingmen would help him out of difficult situations. Günther Rahl, the 3rd highest-scoring ace, was supposedly a superb dogfighter, while the rest of his team were all among the best in Germany. It is fair to say that Hartmann had great backup, which Marseille lacked. Marseille, in contrast, took the opposite approach to Hartmann. Rather than relying on precision and timing for swift hit-and-run attacks, Marseille would regularly engage in dogfights, some of which would be drawn out as he fought multiple enemies. In one engagement, he took on multiple P-40s, where he picked off each aircraft one by one until he emerged victorious. In another case, he took out 17 RAF fighters in a single day. What's more, he also appears to have willingly engaged in such large dogfights, something which we can assume Hartmann would not do, but rather recalculate his approach or simply leave the fight. Marseille had initially employed similar tactics to Hartmann, but would be retrained before his ace career really began. According to his friend Hans Arnold Stahlschmidt, Marseille claimed that he deliberately flew in an unpredictable style, and never did the same things twice. Rather than relying on a single tactic, Marseille said he would practice by entering random positions and then line up the enemy. However, he did often fall back to one consistent method. Rather than chasing or diving, he would try to attack from an angle so as to hit the engine of his adversary. To do this, he would use deflective firing, lining up the enemy's aircraft from the side and then pulling forward until the propeller was below his aircraft's nose. Then he would fire, destroying the enemy with leading shots. When in actual combat scenarios, those around him noted his mastery, both of his aircraft's maneuverability and its guns. One of his claims was that in the clean desert air, a single aircraft was at the advantage against a group of aircraft. Why? Because, he claimed, a single aircraft is only ever acting, firing at whatever he sees, and not having to navigate and avoid other aircraft in his squadron. He believed enemy pilots in groups would default back to a defensive position, stumble over each other, and attempt to reverse the fight into an offensive one. However, Gunther Roll noted that the strength of British pilots was their ability to operate well as a team, and this increased, rather than decreased, their chance of victory. Since World War II, it has become more obvious that the tactics employed on the Eastern Front differed greatly from those on the Western Front. In the past, it was often believed that Luftwaffe pilots serving in the East had an easier time against the enemy than those serving in North Africa or the Western Front. There may be some truth to this, since many Soviet pilots were both under-equipped and under-trained. It is known that some Luftwaffe aces who had seen consistent successes on the Eastern Front would see less success, or in some cases, be shot down once transferred to the Western Front. However, as some have noticed, this may have cut both ways. Siegfried Schnell was an ace on the Western Front and had scored roughly 90 aerial victories, over half of which were RAF Spitfires. He was then transferred to the Eastern Front to fly near Leningrad. Within less than a month after arriving, he was shot down, having scored only 3 kills against the Soviets. This was attributed to his inability to properly adjust for the changed conditions. No doubt there are other similar stories. Hartmann himself noted that certain Soviet aircraft were extremely resistant to machine gun fire, such as the IL-2. His claimed solution for this aircraft was shooting off the oil cooler from below the aircraft. Although many Soviet pilots lacked the experience of the Western Allied pilots, their aircraft were relatively tough. Pilots coming from the Western Front would have had to adapt and develop new tactics. The Soviets also possessed their own great pilots, many of whom emerged later in the war. So to suggest that fighting on the Eastern Front meant engaging easy targets is a disservice to the many fearless pilots that emerged from Russia. It does change one's perception of both Hartmann and Marseille, as well as opening up a whole new dimension to such a comparison. For example, some believe that Heinrich Bahr was technically the best German pilot of the war in this respect, since he saw great success in the Eastern, Western, and Mediterranean theatres. One important consideration, which is hard to gauge on a technical basis, is the level to which the daring nature of each pilot played into their success. What was recognized about both Marseille and Hartmann is that they both possessed a high tolerance for danger. Tactics aside, this attitude would allow the pilot to remain calm, collected, and precise in high-stress situations, perhaps more so than his adversary. It also meant that even if such a pilot employed the wrong tactic at the wrong time, or if an adversary had a superior tactic, the pilot with fearless commitment to the dogfight could eventually turn the fight to his advantage. The daring pilot may also apply more aggressive tactics, with less stress, giving him an advantage over adversaries who may have superior aircraft, yet lack the same nerves of steel. This is still the case today. In beyond visual range combat, both aircraft in a fight choose how long to remain defensive once the missiles start flying. Once both aircraft fire radar-guided missiles, they turn away from their targets, or turn cold, as well as decreasing altitude. This drags the missile into denser, thicker air as well as forcing it to travel further, depleting its fuel and reducing its kinetic energy. Then, both aircraft must turn around and recommit to fire the next missile. The goal is to push as close as possible in order to maximize the probability of a kill. Generally, there are set safe times a pilot should remain cold before recommitting. However, a more aggressive pilot can choose to spend less time defensive and more time pushing forward. He has a heightened risk of being shot down as he spends less time in a flanking or cold bearing relative to the incoming missiles. However, if he can overcome this fear, the more aggressive, daring pilot can keep his adversary in a defensive position, even if his adversary is technically a better trained pilot with a better aircraft, stealth technology aside. although, as has always been the case, it is likely that only a minority of pilots would possess such a nerve. Taking this into consideration, it was known that Marseille would often take on a daring and somewhat reckless approach to dogfights, whilst Hartmann had a proclivity to pull out of a fight if he believed his chance of victory was low. Günther Roll himself said that he would not want to fight Marseille, partially because he believed Marseille was out of his mind, likely alluding to a complete lack of fear. Hartmann also admits that later in the war, he grew uneasy, knowing that Stalin had put out large bounties for both himself and Günther Roll. There are some other technical points of comparison, although they are likely of minimal impact. One would be in regard to the aircraft both pilots flew. Obviously, both operated the 109, however Marseille flew earlier models, whilst Hartmann was known to have flown a vast variety of 109s during the later years of the war. The level to which this played into either pilot's performance is questionable, since Marseille would have gone up against earlier models of the Spitfire and P-40, while Hartmann went up against everything, from early Yaks to late-war Mustangs. Hartmann also turned down the opportunity to fly Me-262s later in the war, which would have had an impact on his performance, in favour of staying with his friends at JG-52. Both pilots appear to have been relatively unbothered by the model of their aircraft. Marseille, from most accounts, didn't care about the variant of 109 he was given, instead emphasising that a pilot must learn his aircraft in and out, and that this, not the aircraft itself, is what would win a fight. Also, it is perhaps possible that Marseille, if he had survived and been transferred to the Eastern Front, would have struggled against the heavily armed Soviet aircraft if he had relied on his own tactics. Again, this is hypothetical, and we will never know. However, it is known that Hartmann's tactics worked equally well against Western aircraft near the end of the war, when he fought against P-51s and such. Thus, at least in this respect, we can reasonably conclude that Hartmann's techniques were successful in both the Eastern and Western theatres. Another point worth considering is how many sorties each pilot flew relative to their victories. It is claimed that Hartmann flew 1,400 sorties, whilst Marseille flew 380. Thus, if a sortie-to-kill ratio was to be calculated, Marseille would emerge on top, scoring roughly 0.4 kills per sortie, in comparison to Hartmann's 0.2 per sortie. Interestingly, and perhaps an indication of a shortcoming, or just pure recklessness, Hartmann was known to get so close to his targets that he would occasionally receive shrapnel coming off the target aircraft. Günther Roll also pushed the envelope with such close combat tactics. It wouldn't be unreasonable to assume many within JG-52 were also using similar extreme tactics. So what can we conclude from these details? In short, both pilots remain among the icons of great military aviators. Both Marseille and Hartmann used unique tactics. Both relied not only on skill and technique, but also on a daring willingness to throw oneself into deadly situations. If both men were in the same model of aircraft, pitted against one another in a dogfight, it would be a safe bet that Marseille would have come out on top. Hartmann himself admitted that he did not like dogfighting. It is also likely that both pilots would have personally clashed had they been in the same squadron, since Hartmann was very much a team player. In one interview, noting that he prioritized his wingmen over scoring kills, he said that if a wingman peeled off to chase an enemy, rather than back up the team, he didn't want them in his squadron. Marseille would have disappointed Hartmann to no end. Hartmann was a great leader, saying that his greatest achievement was not his victories, but the fact that he never lost a wingman in combat. Marseille, however, was a lone wolf of the skies. Ace pilot Adolphe Galland recalled that Marseille was unchallenged amongst his contemporaries, calling him an unrivaled virtuoso. Even during his short career in North Africa, he had achieved 158 victories, almost half that which Hartmann had achieved throughout the entire war. Hartmann, however, held certain skills which Marseille evidently didn't possess, including his ability to hunt down enemies from a great height, position himself undetected, and control his aircraft with such precision as to achieve the kill in a matter of seconds against heavily armoured adversaries. Marseille lacked this finesse, as was evident early in his North Africa career, where he consistently failed to position himself in a tactically advantageous orientation for successful dive attacks. He also lacked the precision in the dive which Hartmann held, to the point where his commander, Neumann, expected much better of him. However, Hartmann disliked the dogfight, relying on his wingman Günther Roll to back him up in sticky situations. Marseille was more than capable of holding his own in an aerial brawl, in one instance engaging 3 Allied aces and emerging victorious. At the end of the day, there isn't really any technical measure to honestly decide who was the better of the two fighter pilots. Perhaps the best way to end this comparison, then, is with the opinions of those closest to the men. There is no doubt that the public remember Hartmann as the highest-scoring ace in history. However, apart from Adolf Galland, many other pilots, including Günther Röhrl, Steinhoff, and even Hartmann himself in his biography, all admit that the greatest pilot in their eyes was Hans-Joachim Marseille.